The air in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel shimmered with the flash of diamonds and the clinking of crystal flutes. For Damien Vance, tonight was the summit of his ambition, a place where power and influence were the only currency that mattered. He stood a titan in a tailored Tom Ford suit, with the perfect woman on his arm. But then, across the room, he saw a ghost from his past. A woman in a simple, unremarkable dress, his ex-wife. A wave of cruel amusement washed over him. He was about to learn that some ghosts don't just haunt you, they come back to claim the throne. The Metropolis Philanthropy Gala was not merely a party, it was a battlefield disguised in velvet and silk. Here, fortunes were silently won and lost in the space of a handshake, and reputations were forged or shattered by a single, well-placed whisper. Damien Vance understood the rules better than anyone. He moved through the glittering throng with the predatory grace of a shark. His smile, a carefully calibrated instrument of charm and intimidation. On his arm was Chloe Sterling, a woman who seemed poured from champagne and sculpted from ambition. Her dress, a creation of shimmering gold sequins by a designer whose name was a password into the highest echelons of society, clung to her like a second skin. She was his perfect accessory, a testament to his success, a living, breathing trophy that screamed to the world, "I have arrived." "Damien, darling," Chloe purred her fingers, tracing the lapel of his tuxedo. "Gregory Shaw is over by the ice sculpture. He hasn't taken his eyes off you." Damien's gaze followed hers. Gregory Shaw, a man whose firm Sterling & Shaw was the only real competitor to Vance Capital, stood with a group of aging investors. He was old money, a dinosaur who believed in legacy and handshakes over aggressive acquisitions. Damien despised him and everything he stood for. "Let him look," Damien said, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a sip of his scotch, the aged liquor a comforting burn in his throat. He's probably wondering how a boy from the wrong side of the tracks managed to build an empire that's about to swallow his. The story was Damien's favourite narrative, one he had polished to a high sheen. The gritty tale of his rise from a working-class neighbourhood, fueled by nothing but raw intellect and a ruthless drive. He'd conveniently edited out the early years, the years of struggle, where he wasn't the lion, but the scrawny cub being fed and nurtured. He'd edited out the person who had done the nurturing, his first wife, Isabel. The thought of her was like finding a piece of grit in a mouthful of oyster, unpleasant and instantly discarded. She was a relic of a past he had shed like a snake's skin. The quiet, supportive girl who had worked 2 jobs to put him through business school, who believed in his dreams when they were nothing but scribbles on napkins in their tiny, cramped apartment. The woman who typed his papers, managed their meager finances, and told him he was brilliant when the world told him he was nobody. He had repaid her, of course. When his first major deal landed, he'd bought her a nice, sensible house in a nice, sensible suburb. He'd thought it was a generous reward, but as his world expanded, hers seemed to shrink. While he was dining with CEOs and flying to international conferences, she was attending PTA meetings and organizing neighborhood book clubs. She hadn't kept up. She hadn't understood that the climb required a different kind of partner. A partner like Chloe who understood the language of power, not the language of encouragement. The divorce had been swift and clinical. He'd been generous with the settlement, he told himself. More than enough for a woman of her simple tastes to live comfortably for the rest of her life. He hadn't heard from her in 5 years, and he preferred it that way. She was a closed chapter, a footnote in his epic biography. "He's coming over," Chloe whispered, her grip on his arm tightening with excitement. Damien straightened his tie, the smirk morphing into a mask of professional cordiality. "Gregory, good to see you. I didn't think these charity circuses were your scene." Gregory Shaw, a man with a face like a weathered cliffside, gave a curt nod. His eyes, pale and shrewd, flickered from Damien to Chloe, taking in the ostentatious display with a flicker of what looked like distaste. "Vance, my wife sits on the board," Some of us still believe in giving back without expecting a press release. The jab was subtle, but it landed. Damien felt a prickle of irritation. Philanthropy is the new frontier of networking, Gregory. You should try it. It might help your firm's antiquated image. Before Shaw could retort, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the crowd. The host of the evening, the universally respected philanthropist and tech billionaire Alistair Finch, was walking toward the stage. The main event is about to start. Chloe breathed, her eyes shining. I heard the guest of honor this year is a total recluse. Some anonymous tech wizard who developed a new platform for charity logistics. Damien feigned a yawn. Probably some pale programmer who hasn't seen the sun in a decade. Let's get this over with. I want to talk to you later, Gregory, about the North Star acquisition. I have a feeling you're about to be outbid. He turned his back on Shaw, a power move designed to assert dominance. He scanned the room, feeling the familiar surge of triumph. He was at the top of his world. Every person in this room was either someone he had beaten someone he was about to beat, or someone who desperately wanted his favor. He was invincible. And then he saw her. Across the sprawling ballroom, standing near a pillar, almost hidden in the shadows. It was her, Isabel. He would have recognized her anywhere, even after all these years, but it was a distorted, funhouse mirror version of her. She was thinner, the soft lines of her face now etched with a quiet confidence he'd never seen before. Her hair, which she used to keep in a practical shoulder-length cut, now fell in dark, elegant waves. But it was the dress that drew his eye and his scorn. In a sea of couture gowns, sparkling with jewels and brand recognition, she was wearing a simple, unadorned dress. It was a column of deep sapphire silk, long-sleeved, high-necked, and utterly devoid of any embellishment. It wasn't ugly, but in this context, it was a declaration of nothing. It was plain. It was forgettable. It was the kind of dress a secretary might wear to an office party. He felt a laugh bubble up in his chest, a harsh, ugly sound. The ghost from his past wasn't just here. She was committing the Gala's greatest sin. She was irrelevant. My God, look at that! Damien chuckled, nudging Chloe with his elbow. He didn't bother to lower his voice. Let the whole world see how far he had come and how far she had fallen. Chloe followed his gaze, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a moue of confusion, then dawning contempt. Who is that? Is she on the catering staff? Worse, Damien said, savoring the moment. That's Isabel, my ex-wife. Chloe's eyes widened, first in shock and then in delicious second-hand victory. She looked from the drab sapphire dress back to her own glittering gold sheath. The comparison was stark, and it was everything. That's her. The one you told me about, the suburban housewife, the one and only Damien, confirmed his voice, laced with mocking pity. I have no idea how she even got a ticket to this event. Probably won it in a raffle at her local library. The two of them shared a laugh, a cruel, private bubble of sound in the sophisticated hum of the gala. To Damien, Isabel's presence was an affront, but also a gift. It was a tangible measure of his success. He was here at the center of the universe with a goddess on his arm. She was there on the periphery, a wallflower in a dress that probably cost less than their bottle of champagne. He watched as she took a glass of water from a passing waiter, her movements graceful and unhurried. She wasn't looking around frantically, trying to network or be seen. She wasn't trying to catch his eye. She seemed perfectly content observing the room with a calm, detached interest that infuriated him. How dare she be calm? She should be ashamed, embarrassed, utterly humiliated to be in the same room as him and his new life. She looks so plain, Chloe observed, her voice dripping with condescension. And that dress. It's a complete non-statement. No designer would ever make something so boring. Belle always had simple tastes, Damien said, using his old pet name for her like a weapon. She wouldn't know a Dior from a discount rack. I remember I once bought her a beautiful diamond necklace for our anniversary. She cried. Tears of joy, I assume, Chloe asked. Tears of guilt. She said the money could have been used to fix the leaky roof. Can you imagine I was trying to give her a taste of the good life, and she was worried about plumbing? He shook his head in theatrical disbelief. That's when I knew it was over. We were speaking different languages. I was speaking the language of ambition and success. She was speaking the language of mediocrity. His gaze remained fixed on Isabel, a man Damien vaguely recognized. Someone with the quiet intellectual air of an academic approached her. They began to speak. Isabel smiled a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. Damien felt an unexpected and unwelcome jolt in his gut. He hadn't seen that smile directed at him in years, not even before the end. The man, whoever he was, laughed at something she said. His expression one of clear admiration. Who was he? A new husband, a boyfriend, some other small-town dreamer she'd latched onto. The idea was pathetic. The man was wearing a standard off-the-rack tuxedo, his shoes well worn. They looked like a match set. Two sparrows in a flock of peacocks. I almost feel sorry for her, Chloe said, though her tone suggested the exact opposite. Trapped in the past while you're building the future. It's actually quite tragic. Tragedy is a strong word. Damien countered his ego, puffing up like a peacock's tail. It was a necessary evolution. Some people are meant to be launching pads, Chloe. They serve their purpose, and then you take flight. You can't carry them with you, or their weight will drag you back to earth. He was so engrossed in his own self-aggrandizing monologue that he almost missed Gregory Shaw watching him from a few feet away. Shaw's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Damien, then flickered over to Isabel, then back again. There was no pity in Shaw's eyes, no amusement. There was something else, something Damien couldn't quite decipher, but it made him uneasy. He dismissed it. Shaw was a relic. What could he possibly understand about modern relationships and the cost of success? Damien decided to press his advantage to make the humiliation complete. He raised his glass in Isabel's direction, a gesture of mock acknowledgement. She didn't see it. She was completely absorbed in her conversation, her back now slightly turned to him. The audacity of it, to not even be looking for him, to be so completely indifferent to his presence. The quiet rage he'd felt earlier began to simmer. He had discarded her. He had been the one to move on to bigger and better things. She had no right to look so whole. She was supposed to be a ruin, a monument to the life she'd lost. Instead, she just looked serene. Let's go and say hello, Chloe suggested suddenly, a wicked glint in her eye. It's the polite thing to do, isn't it? To offer one's condolences. Damien considered it for a second. The idea of standing before Isabel with Chloe, in all her glittering glory, was tempting, a final public demonstration of his victory. But something held him back. It was the look in Shaw's eyes, the quiet confidence in Isabel's posture. A tiny nagging voice in the back of his mind warned him that this was a battlefield and he might not fully understand the terrain. No, he said, his voice clipped. Why would I waste my time? She's a nobody, a ghost, and we don't talk to ghosts. He turned his back on her, a final dismissive act. He would focus on the prize Gregory Shaw and the North Star acquisition. Isabel Reed and her drab little life were beneath his notice. He put her out of his mind completely and utterly. He was a master of his universe, after all, and in his universe she no longer existed. The chandeliers overhead cast a warm golden glow as Alistair Finch tapped the microphone. A wave of respectful silence washed over the ballroom. Finch was a legend not just for the fortune he'd built with his pioneering software company Finch Systems, but for the way he was now giving it away. He was a kingmaker in the world of philanthropy, and when he spoke, everyone listened. Damien stood with his arms crossed, a mask of polite interest plastered on his face. He hated these self-congratulatory speeches. It was all a pretense. Everyone here had written a check, and now they had to sit through a half-hour of sanctimonious drivel before they could get back to the real business of cutting deals. Good evening, and thank you all for being here, Finch, began his voice, calm and authoritative. Tonight we celebrate the spirit of giving. But more than that, we celebrate the spirit of innovation. Because it's not enough to simply throw money at a problem. True change requires a new way of thinking, a new vision. Damien rolled his eyes, subtly. Chloe, sensing his boredom, gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "It'll be over soon," she whispered. "Then you can corner Shaw." For the past year, Finch continued his gaze, sweeping across the sea of expectant faces. The Finch Foundation has been working in secret, with a visionary partner. An individual who saw a fundamental flaw in the landscape of charitable giving. They saw inefficiency, a disconnect between the immense generosity of corporations and the desperate needs of non-profits on the ground. Damien's attention sharpened slightly. He was a man who appreciated efficiency. This was at least getting interesting. This individual envisioned a new system, a platform, one that uses predictive analytics and a sophisticated AI engine to match corporate donors with grassroots organizations, ensuring that resources flow not just to the most well-known charities, but to the most effective ones, regardless of their size or marketing budget. A system to democratize philanthropy itself. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was more than just a new charity, it was a new paradigm. Damien found himself intrigued despite his cynicism. Such a platform would be a powerful tool. The data alone would be worth a fortune. Who was behind it? He mentally scrolled through the usual suspects, the tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, the hedge fund gurus who'd recently found their conscience. The creator of this platform, which we are officially launching tonight, chose to remain anonymous throughout its development. Finch said, a smile touching his lips. They are not a person who seeks the spotlight. They believe, as I do, that the work should always be more famous than the worker. They poured their own resources, their own time and their own genius into this project, seeking no recognition. Damien scoffed internally. No recognition. What a naive concept. Recognition was power. Anonymity was for the weak. Still, he couldn't deny the brilliance of the strategy. Build the hype, create the mystery, and then step into the spotlight to reap the rewards. It was a move he would have respected. This platform is called the Aura Initiative, Finch announced, and on the massive screens behind him, a sleek, minimalist logo appeared, a stylized letter, A, that radiated gentle waves of blue light. And it has the potential to reshape how we heal our world. In its beta phase alone, it has already directed over $90 million in funding to overlooked projects, increasing their operational efficiency by an average of 400%. A collective gasp went through the room. $90 million, 400% efficiency. These were not the soft, sentimental numbers of charity. This was the hard, brutal language of disruption. Damien's mind raced. He had to know who was behind this. He needed to meet them to understand their methods, perhaps even to invest. This wasn't just philanthropy, it was the future. He saw Gregory Shaw lean forward, his expression one of intense concentration. The old dinosaur was smelling the future too. Tonight, the architect of the Aura Initiative has finally agreed to step out from behind the curtain. Finch said, his voice building to a crescendo. Not for personal glory, but because they believe the project has reached a stage where a public face is necessary to guide its expansion. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Damien craned his neck, trying to guess who it could be. Was it Martin Lowell, the reclusive software mogul? Or perhaps Sarah Prentice, the Wall Street quant who had retired at 40? This person is a testament to the fact that true genius is not loud, it is not arrogant, it does not demand attention. Finch declared his words, seeming to hang in the air. It works quietly, diligently, and with a purpose that transcends ego. Damien felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation, as if the words were somehow aimed at him. He glanced over at Chloe, but she was staring at the stage, captivated. This person reminds us that the most brilliant minds are often the ones we overlook. that the greatest strength can come from the quietest corners, that a person's worth is not defined by the labels the world gives them, but by the value they create. The discomfort grew. Finch's speech was veering away from a standard introduction and becoming a lecture, a sermon. A sermon on humility, on substance over style. Everything Damien privately scorned. "It is my profound honour," Alistair Finch said, his voice ringing with genuine heartfelt respect, "to introduce you to the founder and chief architect of the Aura Initiative, the person whose vision we are all here to celebrate tonight. Please welcome to the stage Ms. Isabel Reed." The name hung in the air for a single silent, impossible second. Isabel Reed. For Damien, the world didn't just stop. It fractured. The sound of Alistair Finch's voice seemed to echo from a vast distance, the name ricocheting inside his skull. Isabel Reed. Isabel Reed. It was a name he had buried, a name that belonged to a different life, a different man, a name associated with pot roast PT meetings and a leaky roof. It was not a name that belonged on the lips of Alistair Finch. It was not a name that belonged on this stage. He felt the blood drain from his face. His carefully constructed mask of bored superiority crumbled into dust, leaving behind raw, slack-jawed disbelief. He physically recoiled a small, involuntary step backward, as if he'd been struck. "No," he whispered, the sound a dry rasp in his throat. "No, it can't be." Chloe turned to him, her face a canvas of utter confusion. "Reed like... You're Isabel Reed, is he making a joke?" But it wasn't a joke. From the shadows near the pillar, Isabel Reed began to move. The man she had been speaking with, who Damien now recognized as Marcus Thorne, a highly respected professor of ethics and computer science from MIT, gave her a warm, encouraging smile and a squeeze on the arm before stepping back. And then she walked towards the stage. As she moved into the light, the simple sapphire dress was transformed. It was no longer plain, it was profound. Under the focused spotlights, the silk caught the light, not with a sparkle, but with a deep liquid luminescence like the heart of the ocean. It was a statement of supreme confidence. It didn't need sequins or logos. The woman wearing it was the event. Every eye in the room was on her. And then, as recognition rippled through the few who knew of Damien's past, their eyes darted from her to him. He could feel their gazes like physical blows. He saw Gregory Shaw turn his head slowly, a look of profound, undisguised contempt dawning on his face. He saw investors, colleagues, rivals, all of them looking at him. Their expressions a mixture of shock, pity, and a dawning, brutal understanding. They weren't just looking at him. They were re-evaluating him. They were seeing the man who had laughed at the guest of honor, the man who had mocked the quiet genius in their midst, the man who had thrown away a diamond because he was too stupid to see its worth. The sound that filled the room was a deafening wave of applause. It was thunderous, genuine, and sustained. It wasn't polite charity clapping. It was a standing ovation for a titan. And every clap felt like a hammer blow to Damien's soul. He stood, frozen, a statue of hubris in a Tom Ford suit. His world, which had seemed so solid, so invincible, just moments before, was a house of cards in a hurricane. Chloe's hand, which had been clutching his arm, slipped away. He looked at her and saw the dawning horror in her eyes. It wasn't horror for him. It was horror for herself, for having aligned herself with a fool. The value of her own stock had just plummeted by association. Isabel reached the stage and shook Alistair Finch's hand. She moved with an easy grace, a quiet dignity that radiated a power far more potent than Damien's loud, aggressive dominance. She wasn't the mousy, insecure woman he remembered. Or perhaps he realized with a sickening lurch she had never been that woman. Perhaps that was just the version of her he had created in his own mind to justify leaving her behind. She stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. The room fell silent once more. Her eyes scanned the audience, calm and composed. For a fleeting moment, her gaze passed over him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no anger, no "I told you so." There was nothing. It was the look one gives a stranger in a crowd, a face you see and instantly forget. And that utter lack of recognition, that complete and total indifference, was more devastating than any words of condemnation could ever be. In that single fleeting glance, she erased him from her story. He was not the villain. He was not even a footnote. He was simply, not there. The laughter in the ballroom had died, but Damien could still hear it echoing in his ears. His own cruel braying laugh, a laugh that had not been at his ex-wife's dress, but at his own spectacular world-shattering ignorance. Isabel Reed stood at the podium, a figure of serene authority against the backdrop of her own creation, the glowing Aura logo. The 1,000 pairs of eyes in the room, belonging to some of the most powerful people in the world, were fixed on her waiting. Damien watched, mesmerized and horrified, as if observing his own execution. "Thank you, Alistair," she began, her voice clear and steady. It was the same voice that had once asked him if he wanted coffee, the same voice that had once read bedtime stories, but it was imbued with a new resonance, a new weight. "And thank you all. I'm not someone who is comfortable with the spotlight. In fact, for most of my life, I preferred the shadows." Her eyes swept the room, and a small, wry smile touched her lips. "The shadows are a good place to observe. You see things that people in the spotlight often miss. You see the quiet struggles, the overlooked needs. You see the gaps." Damien felt his collar tighten. Every word, though general, felt like a precision-guided missile aimed directly at his heart. "I'm not a philanthropist in the traditional sense," Isabel continued. "I didn't inherit a fortune, and I didn't build a corporate empire. My currency for many years was time, and I invested that time in learning. After my life took a different direction, I went back to school. I had always loved puzzles, and I saw the world of non-profits as one giant heartbreaking puzzle. So much goodwill, so much passion, but so much inefficiency, so much wasted potential." She had gone back to school. He hadn't known. He had never bothered to ask to find out what she did with her life after he left it. He had just written the checks, signed the papers, and washed his hands of her. The settlement he had thought so generous, she had used it not to live comfortably, but to re-educate herself, to arm herself with knowledge. He had funded the very weapon that was now dismantling his world. The Aura Initiative was born from a simple question. She explained her passion for the subject, making her glow. How can we connect the immense power of corporate capital with the nuanced, specific needs of the people on the front lines? The answer wasn't just about money, it was about data. It was about creating a system that could listen, learn, and direct resources with the intelligence and precision of a surgeon. She went on to describe the architecture of the AI, the ethical considerations programmed by her and her partner, Marcus Thorne, the way it protected the dignity of the recipients while ensuring accountability for the donors. She spoke not in the abstract, but with concrete examples. A small clinic in rural Appalachia that got funding for a new MRI machine because Aura identified a spike in a specific medical condition in their county. A youth center in Detroit that was matched with a tech company to build a coding academy for at-risk teens. She was brilliant. Not just intelligent, but truly breathtakingly brilliant. The concepts were complex, the vision vast, the execution flawless. And he had thought her simple. He had called her mediocre. He had laughed at her. The memory was so vivid, so mortifying that he felt a wave of nausea. True value, Isabel said, her voice softening as she neared her conclusion, is often hidden. It's not in the flashiest package or the loudest voice. It's in the quiet dedication, the relentless pursuit of a solution, the work you do when no one is watching. The Aura Initiative is designed to find that hidden value, to shine a light on the people and projects that the world has overlooked, and to remind us all that the greatest potential often lies where we least expect to find it. She paused, and her eyes for one final moment seemed to find his in the crowd. This time there was a flicker of something. Not pity, not anger. It was a calm, sad finality, the look of a chapter being closed for good. Thank you. The applause that erupted was even more thunderous than before. It was a roar of approval, of awe. Alistair Finch and Marcus Thorne joined her on the stage, and the three of them stood together, a triumvirate of quiet, world-changing power. Damien was invisible. The people around him were no longer looking at him. They were all turned towards the stage, captivated. He turned to say something to Chloe, anything to ground himself, but she was already talking animatedly to a man on her other side, her face alight with opportunistic zeal. She had already cut her losses. She was paddling away from his sinking ship as fast as she could. Then he felt a presence beside him. It was Gregory Shaw. Damien braced himself for a blow, a gloating remark, a final twist of the knife. But Shaw's voice was quiet, almost reflective. I knew her father, you know. Robert Reed, a brilliant engineer. Taught me more about structural integrity in one afternoon than I learned in 4 years of college. He always said his greatest creation wasn't any of his patents, but his daughter. Said she had a mind that could see around corners. Shaw looked from the stage back to Damien, and now his eyes held a cold, clinical judgment. You, Vance, you only see what's right in front of your face. You look at a skyscraper and see the glass and steel. She looks at it and sees the foundation. And you, my friend, you just proved to everyone in this room that you have no foundation at all. Shaw turned and walked away, leaving Damien standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. The laughter he'd shared with Chloe now seemed like the cackle of a madman in an asylum he had built for himself. He had been the apex predator, the king of the Gala, and in the space of 10 minutes he had become the court jester. The only thing he had managed to kill was his own future. The rest of the Gala passed in a blur of humiliation for Damien. The air around him seemed to have changed its composition. It was thin, and he couldn't quite catch his breath. The clusters of people he had schmoozed with earlier now seemed to part like the Red Sea as he approached. Their smiles became tight, their eyes evasive. He was no longer a predator to be feared, but a cautionary tale to be avoided. He was radioactive. Chloe had fully detached, seamlessly integrating into a group, surrounding a tech investor, laughing at their jokes, as if she hadn't just had her own world upended. She was a survivor, and he was a sinking anchor. He saw her glance at him once across the room, her expression a cold, hard calculation. The message was clear. You're on your own. He needed to get out, but his feet felt nailed to the floor. His pride, the very engine of his existence, demanded some kind of action, some way to reclaim control of the narrative. But there was no narrative left to control. Isabel had rewritten the entire book. Finally, he saw his chance. The formal presentation was over, and Isabel was descending the stage steps, speaking quietly, with Marcus Thorne. Alistair Finch was fending off the swarm of well-wishers trying to get to her. For a moment she was relatively isolated, driven by a desperate, toxic cocktail of rage, shame and a pathetic flicker of hope. He moved toward her. He had to say something, to explain, to apologize, to rage. He didn't even know. Isabel, he said. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, thin and reedy. She stopped and turned. The serene, distant expression remained. She looked at him as if he were a junior associate who had forgotten her coffee order. Damien. Marcus Thorne stepped slightly forward, a subtle but unmistakable protective posture. His eyes were cold and intelligent. He knew exactly who Damien was. Damien started, the old pet name slipping out, sounding absurd and presumptuous now. I had no idea. What you've been doing, it's incredible. Thank you, she said, her tone polite and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the kind of thanks you give to a cashier who hands you your change. I mean it, he pressed, his desperation growing. Going back to school, building all this. Why didn't you ever tell me? A faint, almost imperceptible line appeared between her eyebrows. It was a look of genuine confusion. Why would I have told you? My life and what I choose to do with it hasn't been your concern for a very long time. Her words were simple, factual, and they cut him deeper than any insult could. She wasn't trying to wound him. She was simply stating a truth he had been too arrogant to comprehend. Their lives were no longer connected. He had severed the thread himself. But the settlement, he stammered like a fool trying to claim credit for the sun rising. I gave you... Yes, you did, she interrupted, her voice still unnervingly calm. You gave me a severance package for years of service. I am grateful for the seed capital. I believe I have put it to good use. Seed capital, severance package. She had reduced their entire history, their marriage to a business transaction. And worse, he knew she was right. That's exactly how he had treated it. He looked from her face now, so full of a strength he'd never recognized, to Marcus Thorne, who was watching him with undisguised disdain. He saw the partnership there, the mutual respect. He saw the world she had built without him, a world so much richer and more meaningful than the gilded cage he had constructed for himself. I made a mistake, he finally whispered, the confession torn from the very depths of his shattered ego. Isabel looked at him for a long moment. He searched her eyes for a flicker of her old self, for the soft-hearted girl who might have felt a pang of sympathy. He found nothing, only a calm, clear-eyed assessment. No, Damien, she said, her voice finally losing its absolute neutrality and taking on a note of finality, of weary wisdom. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose a life based on what things look like, and I chose to build one based on what they are. You have your life, and I have mine. She gave a slight nod, a gesture of dismissal. Now, if you'll excuse us, Marcus, and I have a meeting with the Secretary of Education. She turned, and together with Marcus Thorne, she walked away, swallowed by a crowd of admirers and people who wanted to change the world with her. She didn't look back. Damien stood alone, the din of the gala fading into a dull roar in his ears. The only sound he could truly hear was the echo of his own laughter, from an hour before, a hollow, foolish sound that now marked the precise moment his entire world had been revealed as a sham. He had laughed at her dress, but the joke he now understood, with devastating clarity, had always been on him. He was the one who was truly impoverished, dressed in nothing but ego and illusion. The sun that streamed into Damien's penthouse the next morning was offensively bright. It sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his sterile minimalist apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny mocking spirits. He was lying on his $1,000 frette sheets, still in the wrinkled remains of his tuxedo, the scent of stale champagne and profound failure clinging to him like a shroud. He hadn't slept. He had replayed the moment Isabel's name was announced 1,000 times, each time, feeling the phantom punch to his gut with fresh, sickening force. He reached for his phone on the marble nightstand, a gesture born of years of habit. Mornings were for reviewing overnight market shifts, for reading emails from his teams in London and Hong Kong. His phone was usually a buzzing hive of activity, a constant affirmation of his importance. This morning, it was silent. The eerie lack of notifications was more alarming than a crisis would have been. He unlocked the screen. There were no urgent emails, no missed calls from investors, just 3 text messages. The first was from Chloe. It arrived at 2:15 a.m., likely sent from the back of an Uber after she'd secured a new, more promising contact at the gala. Damien, what happened last night was a professional catastrophe. For both of us. My publicist agrees it is best for my brand that we make a clean and immediate break. I wish you well. The items you gifted me will be messengered to your office tomorrow. It wasn't even signed. It was a press release for an audience of one. He felt a flicker of rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, heavy wave of something else. Resignation. Of course, this was how it would be. Chloe was a creature of his world, and in his world, You don't stand by a sinking asset. You liquidate. The second message was from his head of PR, sent an hour later. Boss, we have a situation. The Gala is blowing up online. Call me as soon as you're up. We need to get ahead of this. Getting ahead of it was impossible. It was like trying to get ahead of an avalanche. You'd started yourself with a single misplaced step. The third message was a news alert from a major financial publication, time-stamped just before dawn. The headline read, "The Angel of Aura. How Secretive Genius. Isabel Reed built a $90 million philanthropic powerhouse under the radar." He clicked on it, his thumb trembling slightly. The article was long glowing and filled with quotes from Alastair Finch and other tech luminaries. It detailed her journey, glossing over her marriage, but pointedly mentioning her return to academia to earn dual master's degrees in computer science and public policy after a significant life change. The article painted her as a modern-day folk hero, a quiet warrior who had channeled personal adversity into world-changing innovation. The last paragraph was the one that made his stomach clench. Perhaps the most telling moment of the evening, the journalist wrote, came not from the stage, but from the audience. As Ms. Reed received her standing ovation, sources at the gala noted the stunned silence of her ex-husband, Wall Street magnate Damien Vance, who had reportedly been mocking his former spouse's simple attire just moments before the reveal. It was a poignant, if unscheduled, real-life illustration of the very principle the Aura Initiative champions, that true value is often overlooked by those most obsessed with status. He threw the phone across the room. It hit the opposite wall with a dull thud and slid to the floor. They hadn't just reported the story. They had crafted a morality play, and he was the villain. He was the fool. The man obsessed with status. He forced himself into the shower, the scalding water doing little to wash away the grime of his humiliation. He put on his most expensive suit, a dark grey brioni, cinching his tie like a noose. His strategy was simple denial. He would walk into his office project, absolute strength, and act as if nothing had happened. Power was perception. He just had to reset the perception. The moment he stepped into the gleaming lobby of Vance Capital, he knew it was a futile effort. The air was different. The usual, brisk, confident energy was replaced with a hushed, nervous tension. His receptionist, a sharp young woman who usually greeted him with a bright, ambitious smile, suddenly found the screen of her computer intensely interesting. The junior analysts, scurrying past with coffee, averted their gazes. He could feel their whispers on the back of his neck, see the furtive glances in the reflection of the polished marble floors. The rot had already seeped into the foundations of his own empire. His private office, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city, felt less like a throne room and more like a glass cage. He spent the morning trying to work, staring at market data that seemed meaningless. The numbers on the screen were abstract. The judgment in his employee's eyes was real. Just before noon, his secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Shaw is on line 1 for you." A surge of adrenaline. Gregory Shaw. The North Star acquisition. This was it. This was his chance to prove that last night was a footnote, a piece of social gossip, irrelevant to the hard-nosed world of business. He would be ruthless professional. He would crush Shaw and remind everyone who he was. He picked up the receiver. "Gregory, I was about to call you. Let's cut to the chase on North Star. My final offer is 1.2 billion all cash. Take it or leave it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Shaw chuckled. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "Vance, I'm not calling about North Star. I'm calling as a courtesy. The board and I had a meeting this morning. We've decided to reject your offer. In fact, we've decided to cease all negotiations with Vance Capital effective immediately." Damien's blood ran cold. "What? On what grounds? My offer is 20% above market value. Your shareholders will have your head. Our shareholders want stability." Shaw said, his voice as hard as granite. They want a partner with foresight, with sound judgment, not a gambler who makes impulsive bets. This has nothing to do with the deal, Damien snarled, his composure cracking. This is about last night. You're letting personal gossip interfere with your fiduciary duty. Personal gossip. Shaw's voice rose, laced with a potent, righteous anger. Son, I watched you publicly humiliate a woman who is by any objective measure your superior in intellect, vision, and character. A woman who, it turns out, is poised to become one of the most influential figures in the tech and philanthropic sectors. That's not gossip. That is a catastrophic public demonstration of your core weakness. You don't value people, you value ornaments. You don't recognize innovation, you recognize labels. You mistake a loud voice for a strong one. Shaw took a breath. I spoke to her father once, years ago. He told me Isabel could look at a blueprint and see the single point of failure that everyone else missed. Last night, the entire world looked at you and saw the same thing. You, Damien, are a single point of failure. We're not entrusting our company's legacy to you. We've entered into exclusive talks with another firm. The line went dead. Damien held the receiver for a long moment before placing it back in its cradle with a shaking hand. He had lost North Star. It wasn't just a deal, it was a cornerstone of his 5-year growth strategy. The news broke an hour later. The failure of the Vance Capital bid for North Star was reported as a stunning upset. The articles connected it directly to the events of the Gala. The narrative was solidifying. Damien Vance was a liability. His judgment was flawed. His golden touch was gone. The dominoes began to fall with sickening speed. The stock price for Vance Capital, which was built almost entirely on the cult of his aggressive personality, dipped 5%. Then 10. Nervous investors started calling, their voices laced with a new unwelcome skepticism. A major pension fund he'd been courting for months sent a terse email announcing they were re-evaluating their options. He stayed in his office until long after the sun had set, long after the last employee had scurried home. The city that had once been his kingdom now seemed alien and indifferent. Its glittering lights were no longer a promise but a judgment. He was alone, surrounded by the trappings of a success that now felt as hollow as a drum. His computer screen was still on, open to a news site. A new photo had been posted. It was Isabel standing between Alistair Finch and Marcus Thorne on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, her hand on the ceremonial bell. She was smiling, not a wide, triumphant grin, but the same quiet, confident smile he'd seen at the gala. She was not looking back. She was looking forward at a future he was not a part of. A future he had foolishly, arrogantly thrown away. He reached out and switched off the monitor, plunging the room into darkness, save for the cold, distant lights of the city. The silence that filled his office was absolute. It was the sound of a world that had moved on without him. The sound of his own irrelevance. In that glittering ballroom, Damien Vance learned the harshest lesson of his life. The past you think you've buried can rise again, not as a spectre of what was, but as a titan of what it has become. His mockery was a spotlight, but it illuminated his own ignorance, not his ex-wife's simplicity. Isabel Reed's triumph wasn't just in her success, but in her silence, in her complete and utter transcendence of his judgment. She didn't need to fight him, she just had to become herself. What do you think? Was Damien a product of his ambition, or was he always destined to be the man he became? And what would you have done in Isabel's shoes when she took that stage? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
In the ruthless world of New York's elite, a public humiliation is a spectator sport. Richard Sterling thought he'd won the final round against his ex-wife, Catherine. He had the money, the power, and the dazzling new fiancée. He thought he'd left Catherine with nothing. But what happens when the woman you tried to erase doesn't cry? What if she just smiles? turns her back, and walks up the steps of a private jet that makes yours look like a toy. This is a story of how the quietest exit becomes the loudest statement of all. Stick around, the revenge is just getting started. The air in the Sotheby's auction room on York Avenue was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. It was a suffocating blend that Catherine Hayes had once found intoxicating. Now, it just smelled of decay. She sat alone in the 10th row, a ghost in a simple, elegant navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the glittering peacocks preening around her. Her presence was a quiet rebellion. For 5 years, she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a name that opened every door in this city. Now she was just Catherine Hayes, and the only door she was interested in was the one marked Exit. Across the room, Richard was holding court. He wasn't just present, he was performing. His voice, a booming baritone she once found comforting, now grated on her nerves. He was flanked by his new fiancée, Isabella Rossi, a woman who looked like she had been sculpted from marble and draped in diamonds. Isabella was 26, a decade younger than Catherine, with the kind of effortless beauty that demanded attention. On her finger, a diamond the size of a small quail's egg caught the light, shooting out blinding white daggers. Richard made sure everyone saw it, his hand, protectively, possessively on Isabella's, turning it this way and that as he greeted acquaintances. He was a master of the subtle boast, the casual display of overwhelming wealth. Catherine focused on the catalogue in her lap. Lot 37, a collection of rare handwritten letters from Virginia Woolf to Vita Sackville West. They were intimate, raw, and beautiful, a conversation across time between two brilliant women. They had been her holy grail for years. During their marriage, Richard had scoffed at her dusty old papers, preferring to invest in art that screamed its value from the wall. He couldn't understand the quiet thrill of holding history in her hands. The bidding for the letters began. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't about Richard. This was for her. She raised her paddle. The numbers climbed, fast and furious. It was a duel between her and a man in the front row with a slicked-back ponytail. Finally, the ponytail man shook his head. The auctioneer's gaze fell on Catherine. "Sold," he was about to say, when a new voice, loud and clear, from the back of the room, cut through the tension. 200,000. Every head turned. It was Richard. He hadn't even been paying attention. He was looking directly at Catherine, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Isabella giggled, a tinkling, artificial sound. Catherine's blood ran cold. He was doing this purely to spite her. He knew what these letters meant to her. It was a power play, a public humiliation. She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and raised her paddle again. 225,000. Richard laughed, a short, sharp bark. 300,000. The room was silent now, all pretense of polite chatter gone. It was a spectator sport, the ex-wife versus the new fiancé's champion. Catherine's savings could cover this, but it would be a stretch. This was no longer about the letters. It was about drawing a line in the sand. 350,000, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremble. Richard's smirk widened. He didn't even say the number. He just nodded to the auctioneer. The auctioneer, a man named David Abernathy, who had known them both for years, looked uncomfortable. 400,000 to Mr. Sterling. Catherine looked at Richard. He was a predator, toying with his prey. He was enjoying this. He wanted to see her break. He wanted her to retreat defeated. But as she met his gaze, she didn't feel defeated. She felt a strange sense of liberation. He could have the letters. He could have the victory. He was buying pieces of paper. She was buying her freedom. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head to the auctioneer. Sold? Abernathy's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed the breaking of the final invisible chain that had tied her to Richard Sterling. To Mr. Richard Sterling. A polite, scattered applause broke out. Richard leaned over and kissed Isabella a long, theatrical kiss for the benefit of the audience. Catherine stood up. She didn't look at them. She turned and walked out of the auction room, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't see the confused look on Richard's face as he watched her go. He had expected tears, a scene, a storming out. He had not expected this quiet, dignified retreat. He had won the battle, but as Catherine disappeared into the New York City crowds, he had the unsettling feeling that he had just lost the war. He held up his prize, the letters he didn't want, and for the first time felt the hollowness of his victory. The ghost had left the building, but her spectre remained a question mark hanging in the expensive air. 2 days later, the sky over Teterboro, New Jersey, was a brilliant cloudless blue. It was the kind of day that made the private jets lined up on the tarmac gleam like jewels. Catherine Hayes stood by the entrance to the Signature Flight Support Terminal, a single well-worn leather suitcase at her feet. She was dressed for travel in a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater and black trousers. She was flying to London for a book fair, a trip she had planned months ago, a celebration of her new, unencumbered life. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom purred to a stop a few feet away. The driver, a man in a crisp uniform, hurried to open the rear passenger door. Out stepped Richard Sterling, followed by Isabella, who was swathed in a fur coat that was utterly inappropriate for the mild autumn day. Richard's eyes scanned the area and landed on Catherine. He feigned surprise, a poorly acted charade that was almost insulting. "Catherine, what a coincidence!" he boomed, striding towards her. Isabella clinging to his arm. "Richard," Catherine said, her tone flat neutral. She didn't have the energy for his games today. "Off somewhere?" he asked, his gaze flicking to her single suitcase, a silent judgment on her modest luggage compared to the mountain of Louis Vuitton trunks being unloaded from his rolls. "London," she replied simply. "Ah, London. Business, I assume. Still playing with those dusty old books." He gestured vaguely, a dismissive wave of his hand. Before Catherine could answer, he pulled Isabella forward. "Darling, you remember my ex-wife, Catherine?" "Catherine, this is my fiancée, Isabella Rossi." "Of course," Isabella said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. She extended her left hand, not for a handshake, but to display the ring. The diamond, a flawless cushion-cut behemoth, was impossible to ignore. It was a weapon designed to blind and intimidate. "Richard has told me so much about you." "I'm sure he has," Catherine said, her eyes meeting Isabella's. She didn't look at the ring. This deliberate lack of acknowledgement was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. Richard, annoyed that his trump card was being ignored, pressed on. "We're off to St. Bart's for a few weeks, a little pre-wedding getaway, you know how it is. The stress of planning the wedding of the century, why, it takes its toll." He sighed, a theatrical display of the burdens of the ultra-wealthy. "Our jet is just being prepared." He pointed towards a large but slightly dated Bombardier Global Express. "You're flying commercial, I take it must be trying." The condescension was so thick, Catherine could have choked on it. She thought of the years she had endured this, the constant subtle digs, the psychological warfare designed to make her feel small, inadequate. She had absorbed it all, letting it chip away at her sense of self. But no more. "Something like that," she said, a faint enigmatic smile touching her lips. Just then, a low hum grew into a powerful roar. An aircraft impossibly sleek and futuristic was taxiing towards their terminal. It was a Gulfstream G800, the latest and largest purpose-built private aircraft in the world. Its pearl-white fuselage shimmered in the sunlight, its wingtips raked back like a bird of prey. It made Richard's Bombardier look like a relic. The jet came to a graceful stop directly in front of them. The door opened, and a staircase descended with a silent hydraulic hiss. A flight attendant, in a sharp, tailored uniform, appeared at the top of the stairs. "Ms. Hayes, we are ready for you." Catherine picked up her suitcase. She turned to Richard and Isabella. Their mouths were slightly agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. The triumphant smirk had vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a look of utter slack-jawed confusion. Isabella's grip on his arm had tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. "It was interesting seeing you both," Catherine said. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable note of finality in it. "Have a wonderful time in St. Bart's." She walked towards the jet, her steps unhurried, her posture perfect. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel Richard's stunned gaze on her back, a silent testament to the seismic shift that had just occurred. As she ascended the stairs and disappeared into the cool, quiet interior of the G800, the door ceiling shut behind her, Richard Sterling was left standing on the tarmac, the gaudy diamond on his fiancée's hand, suddenly looking small and insignificant under the shadow of the magnificent aircraft that had just swallowed his ex-wife whole. The ghost of his past had not only returned, she had upgraded, and he had no idea who he was up against. The interior of the Gulfstream G800 was a sanctuary of understated luxury. There was no gold-plated tackiness, no ostentatious displays of wealth that Richard would have insisted upon. Instead, the cabin was a symphony of soft grays, cream-colored leather, and dark-polished wood. It was spacious, quiet, and calming. As Catherine settled into a plush armchair, a sense of peace washed over her, a feeling she hadn't realized she had been missing for years. A man emerged from the forward cabin, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build that his impeccably tailored suit couldn't conceal. His hair was dark, with distinguished flecks of silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startlingly intelligent shade of blue, crinkled at the corners as he smiled at her. This was Julian Croft. "I saw that little drama on the tarmac," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "I almost sent the co-pilot out with a bucket of popcorn." He handed her a glass of water. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Catherine said, taking a sip. "I think I just shed the last 10 pounds of a very toxic marriage." Julian laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the cabin. He took the seat opposite her. "Richard Sterling, I had my team do a little digging after you first mentioned him. A classic narcissist. All flash, no substance. His entire self-worth is tied to the perception of others. Men like that are incredibly fragile." "You have no idea," Catherine murmured, looking out the window as the jet began its powerful, smooth ascent. The world and her past shrank beneath them. She had met Julian Croft 6 months ago at a small independent bookstore in Greenwich Village. She had been reaching for a first edition of Mrs. Dalloway, and so had he. They had struck up a conversation, a real conversation, about books, art, and the quiet joys of a life lived outside the spotlight. He had introduced himself as Julian a consultant. It was only weeks later, after a series of long dinners and walks through Central Park, that she discovered consultant was a massive understatement. Julian Croft was the founder and CEO of a global technology firm that specialized in data security and artificial intelligence. He was a billionaire, but he wore his wealth like a comfortable, well-worn coat, not a suit of armor like Richard. He was fiercely private, rarely photographed, and his name was more likely to be found in the footnotes of academic journals than in the gossip columns. He was flaunting his fiancée's ring, Catherine said, a small, wry smile on her face. It was the size of a doorknob. "And you?" Julian said, his blue eyes twinkling, countered with a G800. "A rather effective checkmate, I thought." "It wasn't my intention," she said, though she couldn't deny the small, wicked thrill she had felt. "But I'm not going to pretend it wasn't satisfying." "Good," Julian said. "You've spent too long diminishing yourself to make a small man feel big. That chapter is over." He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. "How are the Virginia Woolf letters?" Catherine's heart sank a little. "He bought them. Outbid me at the Sotheby's auction. It was a deliberate act of cruelty." Julian was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see." He took a sip of his drink. "Well, perhaps it's for the best. Sometimes you have to let go of old things to make room for the new." He changed the subject, steering the conversation towards the London Book Fair, asking her about the dealers she was excited to meet, the lectures she planned to attend. He listened, truly listened, his attention focused entirely on her. It was this more than the private jet or the limitless resources at his disposal that was the true measure of the man. He saw her, the real her, the woman who loved dusty old books and quiet afternoons. With Richard, she had been an accessory, a beautiful object to be displayed. With Julian, she was a partner. As they flew east, chasing the sun, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness. The turbulence of her past was finally smoothing out into clear, open skies. She was no longer a ghost at someone else's feast. She was the guest of honor at her own. She leaned her head back against the soft leather, the hum of the powerful engines, a lullaby of her new life. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely and utterly safe. The man in the jet was not just her billionaire boyfriend. He was her safe harbor, the quiet, steady anchor in the storm she had just escaped. And together, they were flying towards a future she was finally excited to embrace. Richard Sterling stood on the tarmac at Teterboro, long after the Gulfstream G800 had become a silver speck in the vast blue sky. The roar of its engines had been replaced by a ringing in his ears. The triumphant high from the auction, the smug satisfaction of flaunting his wealth, had evaporated, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. "Richard, darling, are we going?" Isabella's voice, usually a melodic purr, was sharp, impatient. The pre-wedding glow had been replaced by a pout. Her perfect St. Bart's vacation was being delayed. "What was that?" Richard muttered, not to her but to himself. "Whose jet was that?" "How should I know?" Isabella snapped, pulling her ridiculous fur coat tighter around her. "Does it matter? It's probably a rental. She's probably shacking up with some vulgar new money type to pay her bills." But Richard knew it wasn't a rental. He had seen the discreet custom logo on the tail fin, a stylized C intertwined with a J. That was a private insignia. That was ownership, and the G800, he knew what those cost. The base model was nearly $80 million. With custom interiors, you were pushing $100 million. That wasn't new money, That was a different stratosphere of wealth, a level that made his own considerable fortune feel pedestrian. The flight to St. Bart's was tense. Richard was silent, staring out the window, replaying the scene at the airfield over and over in his mind. Catherine's calm, her enigmatic smile, her complete and utter lack of intimidation. It was as if she was a different person. The quiet, accommodating woman he had divorced, the woman he had so easily crushed at the auction, was gone. In her place was this cool, confident stranger who boarded $100 million jets as if she were hailing a taxi. As soon as they landed and checked into their beachfront villa at the Eden Rock, Richard was on the phone. He called his PI, a former NYPD detective named Sal Moretti. "Sal, I need you to find something out for me," Richard said, pacing the marble floors of the villa. "A Gulfstream G800 tail number. I didn't get it, but it had a custom logo on the tail, a J and a C intertwined. A G800. That's a big bird, Richard. Not many of those around," Sal said. "What's this about?" "My ex-wife was on it." Richard said the words, tasting like ash. "Catherine, I thought she was, well, you know." "Yeah, well, apparently not," Richard grumbled. "Find out who owns it, and find out who she was with. I want a name, Sal. I want to know everything." The wait was agonizing. Richard tried to play the part of the doting fiancé, taking Isabella to designer boutiques in Gustavia and to dinner at Benito, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of Catherine and her new life. Isabella, sensing his distraction, grew increasingly petulant. "Richard, are you even listening to me?" she complained over a plate of ridiculously expensive lobster. "I was talking about the seating chart for the wedding. We can't put my mother next to your Aunt Carol, not after the incident at the engagement party." "Fine, whatever you want, Isabella," he said, waving his hand dismissively as he checked his phone for the 10th time that hour. The call from Sal came 2 days later. Richard was sitting by the infinity pool, a cocktail sweating in his hand. "I have a name for you, Richard," Sal said, his voice grim. "But you're not going to like it." "Just tell me," Richard snapped. "The jet is registered to a shell corporation, but the beneficial owner is a man named Julian Croft." The name meant nothing to Richard. Julian Croft. Who the hell is Julian Croft? He's the founder and CEO of a company called Helios AI. They're a global tech firm. Data security, artificial intelligence, government contracts. He's very, very private. Almost a ghost. No social media, very few public photos. But he's significant. Significant. What does that mean? How much is he worth? This was the metric Richard understood. This was the language of his world. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, this guy isn't in your league. He's not even playing the same sport. We're talking about a net worth estimated to be north of $30 billion. With a B." The cocktail glass slipped from Richard's hand and shattered on the stone patio. $30 billion. The number was so vast, it was almost incomprehensible. It was a figure that turned his own $250 million net worth into pocket change. It was the kind of wealth that didn't just buy jets. It bought influence, power, silence. It was the kind of wealth that could make a man like Richard Sterling disappear without a trace. "Are you sure?" Richard whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm sure," Sal said, "and there's more. I looked into Croft's recent activities. He's a major philanthropist, but he does it all anonymously. A few months ago, one of his foundations made a significant acquisition in the world of rare books and manuscripts." A cold dread washed over Richard. What? What acquisition? He bought the entire archives of the Hogarth Press, the publishing house founded by Virginia and Leonard Woolf. The entire collection, letters, manuscripts, first editions, everything. It was a private sale, very quiet. The seller was a small, struggling university press in England. Richard sank into a lounge chair, his head spinning. The letters. The Virginia Woolf letters he had bought at Sotheby's to humiliate Catherine. They were a drop in the ocean compared to what this man, this Julian Croft, had given her. Richard had bought her a page. Croft had bought her the entire library. The dusty old papers Richard had mocked were now the foundation of a collection curated by one of the world's richest men. Catherine hadn't lost at the auction. She had just been letting him win a meaningless skirmish while she was on her way to claiming an empire. He looked at Isabella, who was taking selfies by the pool, pouting her lips at her phone's camera. He looked at the diamond on her finger, the ring he had been so proud of. It suddenly looked cheap, garish, a desperate plea for attention. His world, so carefully constructed on a foundation of perceived superiority, was beginning to crack. And in those cracks, a terrifying, new reality was taking root. Catherine Hayes, his mousy, unassuming ex-wife, was now involved with a man who could buy and sell him 100 times over without even noticing. The unraveling of Richard Sterling had begun. The annual conservation gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was the glittering apex of the New York social season. It was a night where fortunes were pledged, reputations were polished, and the city's intricate power dynamics were on full public display. For Richard Sterling, it had always been a home game, a night to reinforce his status at the center of this universe. This year, however, the universe seemed to have tilted on its axis. He and Isabella arrived in a flurry of camera flashes, Isabella in a Scarlett O'Hara-esque crimson gown that was designed to make an entrance. Richard, in a classic Tom Ford tuxedo, played his part, smiling for the cameras, his hand firmly planted on the small of Isabella's back. But his eyes were scanning the crowd, searching for a ghost. He didn't have to search for long. He saw her across the great hall, standing near the entrance to the Temple of Dendur. It was Catherine, and she was breathtaking. She was wearing a simple column-like gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of delicate diamond and sapphire earrings. She was talking to a small group of people, and as she laughed at something one of them said, the sound seemed to carry across the cavernous space a note of pure, unadulterated joy. Beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm, was Julian Croft. In person, he was even more imposing than Richard had imagined. He radiated a quiet intensity, a stillness that was more powerful than Richard's practiced bravado. He wasn't looking around the room, seeking approval or attention. His focus was entirely on Catherine. The whispers started almost immediately. "Is that Catherine Hayes? Who is she with? I've never seen him before. That's Julian Croft, the Helios AI guy. No, it can't be. He never comes to these things. Well, he's here now, and he can't take his eyes off her." Richard watched as a procession of people he had considered his allies, his friends, made their way towards Catherine and Julian. People who had dropped Catherine from their guest lists the moment the divorce was announced. People who had sided with him, who had listened to his version of the story. Now, they were fawning over her, their smiles wide, their laughter a little too loud. He saw Jonathan and Beatrice Vance, a couple he had known for 20 years, practically elbow their way through the crowd to greet Catherine with effusive air kisses. Beatrice had once told Isabella that Catherine was a lovely girl, but a bit of a bore. Now she was hanging on Catherine's every word. The ultimate humiliation came when Richard and Isabella approached the main receiving line for the museum's director, Daniel Weiss. They were standing behind the Vances, who were now chatting animatedly with Catherine and Julian. As the line moved forward, Daniel Weiss greeted the Vances, then his eyes lit up as he saw the couple behind them. "Julian, I can't believe you made it," Weiss said, bypassing Richard completely to shake Julian's hand warmly. "And Catherine, you look absolutely stunning. We were so thrilled when we heard about the endowment for the new manuscript wing. It's a game changer for us." Richard froze. The manuscript wing, he shot a look at Catherine. She met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was just a quiet confidence that was more unnerving than any overt display of victory. "Richard, Isabella, so good to see you," Weiss said, finally turning to them, his tone polite but noticeably cooler. The moment was fleeting, but in the shark-infested waters of Manhattan society, it was a mortal wound. They had been snubbed. Publicly, Isabella was seething. "What was that all about?" she hissed as they moved away from the receiving line. "A manuscript wing? Is that where her new boyfriend is parking his money? How utterly dull." But Richard knew it wasn't dull. It was strategic. It was a display of power that was both subtle and absolute. He wasn't just buying her jets. He was building her legacies. He was immortalizing her passion in the stone and glass of the world's most famous museum. What could Richard's diamond ring compete with that? Throughout the dinner, the humiliation continued. Their table, usually a prime spot near the stage, was in a less desirable location closer to the kitchens. From across the room, Richard could see Catherine and Julian seated at the director's table, flanked by senators, artists, and titans of industry. He watched as Julian leaned over and whispered something in Catherine's ear, making her laugh. The intimacy of the gesture was a knife in Richard's gut. He was losing. He was losing a game he hadn't even known he was playing. His wealth, his status, his beautiful fiancée, the pillars of his identity, were proving to be a house of cards in the face of Catherine's new reality. He had thought he had erased her, but instead she had been reborn stronger, more radiant, and powered by a force he could not comprehend or compete with. The whispers at the Met were a death knell for the world he had known. The ghost of his past was now the queen of the ball, and he was just a spectator in the cheap seats watching her coronation. The days following the Met Gala were a slow-motion nightmare for Richard Sterling. His world, once a glittering fortress of his own making, was being dismantled brick by brick. The story of his public snubbing had become a cautionary anecdote whispered over cocktails at the Bemelman's bar and dissected at lunches at La Goulou. Business associates who once clamored for his time now had secretaries who informed him they were in meetings indefinitely. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the edges of a world that no longer wanted him. His relationship with Isabella crumbled under the pressure. Her affection had been transactional, a currency exchanged for the status he provided. With his social capital plummeting, she had become openly contemptuous. The wedding planning devolved into a theater of cruelty. "Are you sure you can still afford the custom-built ice sculpture of two swans kissing?" she asked one evening, her voice dripping with venom as she browsed a bridal magazine. They were in their cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment, which suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a gilded cage. "Perhaps we should scale back. We don't want to look desperate. It's so unbecoming." The final fatal blow came 2 weeks after the gala. Richard was banking on a merger with a rival firm, a deal that would have been a lifeline, a public declaration that he was still a player. The CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, with whom he'd shared cigars and golfed for years, called him personally. "Rich bad news," Marcus said, his voice strained with false sympathy. "The board's got cold feet, unforeseen market volatility." But Richard heard the truth in the silence between the words. Marcus's wife, a formidable woman who chaired 2 museum boards, had been at Daniel Weiss's table at the Met. She had witnessed his humiliation firsthand. It wasn't market volatility, it was social contagion. He was toxic. A black venomous rage began to boil in his gut. It was a potent cocktail of wounded pride, consuming jealousy, and a bizarre, twisted sense of ownership over the woman at the center of it all. Catherine. It was all her fault. He became obsessed. He had his PI Sal send him daily reports on her movements on Julian Croft. He learned that Croft had not only bought her the Hogarth Press archives, but had also established a fellowship in her name at Columbia University for the study of modernist literature. Each new detail was another twist of the knife. Driven by this corrosive fury, he did something he knew was reckless. He found out where she was living. It wasn't hard. The entire city was buzzing about the triplex penthouse Julian Croft had recently purchased at 220 Central Park South, the so-called billionaire's bunker. He went there on a Tuesday afternoon, a man on a mission of self-destruction. In the taxi ride downtown, he rehearsed his speech, a tirade of accusations and blame. When he arrived, he strode into the limestone-clad lobby, a place of hushed, intimidating wealth. The doorman, a man he would have once tipped $100 without a thought, regarded him with cool indifference. "I'm here to see Catherine Hayes," Richard announced, his voice a little too loud. "Is she expecting you, sir?" the doorman asked, not moving. "We're old friends." Richard bluffed the words, tasting like acid. He flashed a Patek Philippe watch like a badge of honor, but the doorman was unimpressed. Richard's name, it seemed, was no longer a key that opened all doors. He was forced to use a connection, calling a friend on the building's board to be allowed up. The humiliation of it stoked his rage even further. He rode the private elevator, its walls lined in brushed bronze, his heart pounding a frantic, angry rhythm. The ascent was silent smooth and felt like a journey to his own execution. When the doors opened directly into the apartment's foyer, he was momentarily stunned into silence. The space wasn't just large. It was a testament to a level of taste and wealth he'd only ever pretended to have. The marble floors were a seamless expanse of white, veined with subtle gray. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed Central Park like a living masterpiece. The art on the walls was quiet but significant, a small, pensive Rothko, a delicate Twombly. There was no gold, no glitz, none of the gaudy, look-at-me decor he favored. It was the home of someone who didn't need to shout about their money. And there, standing in a pool of afternoon sun, was Catherine. She was arranging a simple bouquet of white tulips in a vase, and she didn't look surprised to see him. She just looked weary. "Richard," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you shouldn't be here. I needed to talk to you, Tick," he snarled, striding into the room. "What is this, Catherine? What are you doing?" "I'm arranging flowers," she replied, her preternatural calmness infuriating him. "Don't play dumb with me," he exploded, his voice cracking. "This," he gestured wildly, his arm encompassing the whole panoramic view. "The jet, the Gala, this palace in the sky. Who are you? You are my wife. You were a librarian's daughter from Ohio. I found you. I made you. You were perfectly happy with a book and a cup of tea. "I'm still that person, Richard," she said quietly, placing a final tulip in the vase. "You just never bothered to look closely enough to see the rest of me. You saw a reflection of yourself, and you were angry when I didn't match the image you'd created." "And him," Richard spat the word out. "This Julian Croft, you leave me, and you immediately find one of the richest men in the world. Is that what this was all about? Were you planning this all along? Playing the mousy little bookworm while you waited for a bigger fish?" Catherine finally put down her garden shears and turned to face him fully. Her eyes, which he had once thought of as merely pretty, were now blazing with a cold fire he had never seen before. "No, Richard, that's your playbook, not mine. You're the one who equates a person's worth with their bank balance. I fell in love with a man who listened to me, who respected me, who saw me as an equal. His wealth is incidental. It's his character that I love." "Character?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think he has character, men? Like that don't get to where they are by being nice guys. They're sharks, Catherine, just like me." "You're wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than a shout. "He's nothing like you." She took a step closer, and for the first time, Richard felt a flicker of actual fear. "And speaking of character, I think it's time we had an honest talk about yours." She walked over to a sleek minimalist desk and picked up a slim, leather-bound folder. "Julian's people, as you would call them, are very thorough. When he fell in love with me, he became concerned about you. Not as a rival, but as a threat. So they did a little digging into our marriage, into our finances." She opened the folder. "Do you remember the Sterling Opportunities Fund, the private investment fund you started during our last year together? The one you told me was too complicated for me to understand?" Richard's blood ran cold. "That's none of your business. It became my business when you forged my signature on the incorporation documents, making me a liable partner without my knowledge," Catherine said, her voice like ice. "It became my business when you used it as a shell to illegally hide marital assets from our divorce settlement. And it became my business, Richard, when you used it to commit insider trading based on confidential information you wheedled out of my father's oldest friend at the SEC, a dear man you knew I trusted implicitly." She slid a document across the polished surface of the desk. It was a copy of a wire transfer from the Sterling Opportunities Fund to an offshore account dated 2 days before a major corporate acquisition was announced. A transaction Richard had thought was buried under layers of corporate deceit. "This is a copy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The originals, along with a sworn affidavit from your former accountant, a man you fired without severance last year who was more than happy to talk, are with the SEC. They are very interested in your complicated fund. The merger you were so excited about, it didn't fall through because of market volatility. It fell through because Marcus Thorne was given a friendly, anonymous warning that he was about to merge with a man under active federal investigation." Richard stared at the paper, his world collapsing in on itself. The bravado, the anger, the jealousy, it all drained away, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He had been so focused on Catherine's new life, on the man she was with, that he had never considered that they might be looking back at him with a high-powered telescope. He had seen her as a ghost to be haunted, not a force to be reckoned with. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking the sound, pathetic even to his own ears. "Why are you doing this?" Catherine looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of profound, sad finality. "You could have just let me go, Richard. You could have taken your petty victory at the auction and your new life and just walked away, but you couldn't. Your ego wouldn't allow it. You had to try and crush me one last time. You had to prove you were the winner. Well, congratulations. You've won. You've won an SEC investigation, the end of your engagement, and the complete and utter destruction of the reputation you worked so hard to build. She walked past him towards the window, overlooking the park, turning her back on him for the last time. The doorman will show you out. Goodbye, Richard. He stood there for a long moment, a statue in the ruins of his own life, before turning and walking towards the elevator, a defeated man, finally truly understanding the meaning of the word loss. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost himself in the process. The confrontation was over, and there was no doubt who had emerged the victor. The Mediterranean sun was a warm liquid gold blanket on Catherine's skin. She was lying on a plush lounger on the deck of the Ataraxia Julian's magnificent 200-foot sailing yacht as it cut a silent, graceful path through the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. The name, she had learned, was the Greek philosophical term for a state of serene calmness, of being undisturbed by life's chaos. It was a perfect description of her life now. It had been 6 months since the confrontation in the penthouse, 6 months since Richard had walked out of her life and into the ruins of his own. The fallout had been swift and brutal, a public spectacle that Catherine had watched from a quiet distance. The SEC investigation had become front-page news, with the Wall Street Journal running a series of articles detailing the Sterling Opportunities Fund scandal. They painted a damning portrait of a man consumed by greed and arrogance. Isabella, in a move of breathtakingly predictable self-preservation, had fled the sinking ship. Her publicist issued a statement, dripping with faux sincerity, announcing the end of the engagement due to irreconcilable differences in personal ethics. The statement went on to detail Isabella's newfound commitment to philanthropic causes that support transparency and female empowerment. The last Catherine had heard Isabella was being photographed on the arm of a minor European royal with a storied title and notoriously empty pockets. She had traded one form of currency for another. Richard, stripped of his company, his fiancée, and his reputation, had been forced to sell his assets at fire sale prices to cover his legal fees and fines. The Bombardier jet, the Rolls-Royce, the Fifth Avenue apartment, all were gone, liquidated to pay for his hubris. He had retreated from public life, a disgraced footnote in the annals of New York society. Catherine felt no joy in his downfall, only a quiet, sad sense of inevitability. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and it had been washed away by a tide of his own making. Julian emerged from the cabin, a tray in his hands, bearing 2 glasses of chilled white wine and a small plate of figs and cheese. He sat down beside her, his presence a comforting warmth that had become the anchor of her world. "A message came through for you on the satellite comms," he said, handing her a glass. "From David Abernathy at Sotheby's." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I thought I was off his list of high-value clients." Julian's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Apparently you're back on it. It seems a certain collection of Virginia Woolf's letters to Vita Sackville West are back on the market. The previous owner defaulted on his payment." He let the statement hang in the warm air. "Abernathy was wondering if you were still interested. He said he could secure them for you privately before they go to auction again." Catherine stared out at the endless blue horizon. She thought about the letters, about the desperate hunger she had felt for them. She thought about the woman she had been in that auction room, feeling small and powerless, seeing those pages as a lifeline to a world of substance she felt denied. She thought about the sting of Richard's casual cruelty, and she realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the hunger was gone. "No," she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Tell him thank you, but I'm not interested." Her passion for those letters had been a symptom of a deeper need, a need to connect with a life of the mind, a life of meaning that had been starved in her marriage. Now, she was living that life every day. She and Julian spent their evenings reading to each other, debating philosophy, and planning the curriculum for the new literary foundation they had endowed. The letters were a symbol of a craving that had now been satisfied. "I have the real thing now," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. She leaned over and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss, filled with gratitude and a peace she had once thought unattainable. "I don't need to buy someone else's love letters." Julian smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." He gestured towards a small, leather-bound book on the table beside them, an object she hadn't noticed before. "Because I have something for you." Catherine picked it up. The leather was soft and worn, a deep navy blue. There was no title on the cover, only a small embossed C in the bottom corner. She opened it. Inside, on the first page, in elegant, familiar handwriting, were the words, "The collected thoughts of Julian Croft, on first meeting Catherine Hayes and thereafter." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and overwhelming emotion. "You wrote this?" "I started it the day we met in that bookstore," he said, a faint, endearing blush on his cheeks. "I jot down things after our conversations. It's a bit rambling, I'm afraid, and my penmanship is terrible, but it's all true." Her fingers, trembling slightly, turned the pages. It was filled with observations about her quotes from books they had discussed, half-formed poems and heartfelt declarations of his growing love. One entry, dated a week after they met, read, "She speaks of books not as objects, but as old friends. Her passion isn't for the value of a first edition, but for the soul of the story within. She is the rarest thing I have ever encountered, a person who is entirely authentically herself." It was more intimate, more precious than any collection of famous letters could ever be. It was their history, their story written not for the world, but just for her. It was proof that she had been seen, truly seen, from the very beginning. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the ink on the page. But they were not the tears of sadness or humiliation she had once known so well. They were tears of pure, cleansing joy. The ghost of her past was finally completely gone. The auction, the ring, the drama, it all felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. She closed the book and held it to her chest as if it were the most valuable thing in the world, and to her, it was. She looked out at the endless expanse of the sea, at the horizon, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. It was a vista of infinite possibility. She had her own letters now, her own story, her own quiet, unshakable love. This was her new beginning, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever dared to imagine. In the end, this wasn't a story about the triumph of wealth over wealth. It was a story about the triumph of substance over flash, of character over reputation. Catherine Hayes didn't need a billionaire to save her. She needed to save herself, to remember the woman she was before the world told her who she should be. Julian Croft wasn't her rescuer. He was the partner she deserved, a man who valued her mind more than her appearance, her passion more than her pedigree. Richard Sterling's empire crumbled because it was built on ego and illusion. Catherine's new life is flourishing because it's built on the bedrock of authenticity, respect, and a love that is as deep and as real as the sea. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate revenge? Let us know in the comments below. If you love stories of dramatic twists and ultimate vindication, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, and subscribe for more tales of love loss and sweet, sweet karma.